So, Paul, how come that Europe went from being a net exporter of aluminium to a net importer in the space of basically 20 years?
That's a big question. But I think it probably begins and ends with
Once a symbol of industrial strength, aluminium helped build modern Europe. But in just 2 decades, we lost much of our ability to produce it. Today, we import what we used to make, and the reasons are not just economic, they are political. Paul Voss is Secretary General of European Aluminium. For the past 3 years, he's been the industry's lead advocate, pushing for competitiveness, investment, and serious policy change.
Europe is finding it increasingly difficult to come by the cheap energy prices that underpin a healthy economy and a healthy industrial base. I can imagine a scenario where in 2040 we do have an energy system that's largely driven by renewable energy. There's a kind of valley of death period in the meantime where energy is expensive here.
We talked about where the energy transition is falling short and why Europe's industrial rivals are pulling ahead. We talked about China, the US, and the uncomfortable choices no one wants to make. This isn't just a story about aluminium, it's a story about what kind of economic power Europe still wants to be and what it's willing to risk to get there. So, Paul, how come that Europe went from being a net exporter of aluminium to a net importer in the space of basically 20 years?
That's a big question. But I think it probably begins and ends with energy. Europe is finding it increasingly difficult to come by the cheap energy prices that underpin a healthy economy and a healthy industrial base anywhere. Our energy costs compared to competitors in the US and China are far too high. And I mean, it's easy for people to point to the energy transition and the associated costs as an explanation, but there are structural issues there as well. What the US has done with shale gas hasn't been done and will not be done, in my view, in Europe. Of course, there are regulatory costs. The ETS has a cost, but I don't think that the cost of the ETS over the last 20 years explains Europe's competitiveness gap. Energy is expensive here and will remain expensive here. I hear a lot about renewables kind of saving the day, and I can imagine a scenario where in 2040 or 2047 or something like that, we do have an energy system that's largely driven by renewable energy. That will require a lot of building out of renewable production capacity, of the grid, of flexibility, of storage solutions. If everything goes really well, we might have a setup like that 20 years from now, which could become a real advantage. But there's a kind of valley of death period in the meantime where energy is expensive here. And more than anything else, that's been our problem.
Yeah, and a little disclaimer that I've been working for the aluminium industry for many years before moving to packaging, and so I lived really the early years of that loss of competitiveness starting, so the closure of the big aluminium smelting plants across Europe. And as you said, it's not so much probably the root causes of the loss of competitiveness to be looked necessarily into, let's say, the green energy transition. But probably the big elephant there was the electricity market liberalization in the early 2000s, with the probably massive issues, the biggest issue of all for energy-intensive industry, and aluminium probably was the first victim of that because of its electricity consumption, has been the end of long-term contracts for aluminium smelters, which the liberalization of the electricity markets, which sounds on paper like a great thing, but basically deprived these massive plants from a reliable source of energy at constant prices for the foreseeable 10, 20 years. So is that really also from your perspective something that started to drag down the competitiveness of aluminium in Europe?
Yeah, I mean, So I arrived at the end of all this. You know, I came to aluminium 3 years ago, and this was basically a fait accompli. The smelters had closed or were closing, or let's use a slightly more optimistic word and call them curtailed. But sure, and I have every sympathy for the idea of liberalization of the energy market. I can understand why it appeals to an economist, to a lawmaker. It makes a great deal of sense in theory, but yeah, aluminium is a very particular thing. It's a highly electro-intensive business, and it requires long-term certainty about supply and about cost. And from the minute you take that away, I mean, there may be an argument that liberalization helps you kind of optimize around the margin, but it takes away that security, that certainty, that long-term horizon that's required for the maintenance of a business like this. And yeah, we have really struggled. As I say, I arrived when all this was happening and basically a done deal. And now the question is, can this be turned around, or is it fundamentally too late?
Yeah, I mean, the numbers are incredible. And, you know, to your point, can this be turned around? Because Europe in 2000 had 30% of the global aluminum production. And then today is only 3.4%. So we're talking about 2 million tons a year, where China basically started the development of its aluminum industry in the early 2000s. And today, already nearly immediately after, already probably 8 years, became a world leader. So today has, you know, over 50% of global aluminum production. So is again, you know, how are we ever going to be able, and what will it take, you know, to try and get clearly not all of it back, but somehow to make the business case for aluminium, particularly smelting, so that the upstream part of the aluminium industry to invest in Europe.
Yeah, and of course, that's not just a matter of European decline, but of Chinese growth. And of course, they have perfectly legitimate ambitions to develop their industry. So if you talk about global market shares, yeah, what's happened in China over the last 20, 30 years, whether it's aluminium or anything else, it's been absolutely spectacular. And it turns upside down the numbers that we would have been used to seeing 20 years ago. Everything's different.
Mm-hmm. But are we right in saying that most of the aluminium, primary aluminium that we get into the European Union doesn't necessarily come from China, but is mostly coming from the Nordics, like Norway, Iceland, and from the Gulf region, where most of this production kind of moved to, or was already there in the case of the Nordics, moved to the Gulf area because of that stable, you know, access to energy.
China doesn't export primary aluminium, or at least not in any significant volumes. What they export to Europe are semi-finished products, the stuff that they make out of it, extruded products, flat rolled products. Yeah, and you see this in all kinds of different industries. China is steadily moving up the value chain. What we've noticed in the last, 3-4 years anyway, since I've been around, there's huge investment going on in China on the secondary side, production from recycled metal. And the numbers, as always with China, are mind-boggling. I mean, 35 million tons of recycling capacity coming online in the next few years. It dwarfs anything that we do here. And so we need to be thoughtful about the type of engagement that we have with China. Of course, we cannot stop China investing, and we cannot stop China taking the decision to develop vertically integrated value chains and so on. But we can be thoughtful about our own choices. And one of the most important choices facing Europe right now is, do we want to retain an industrial base here on this continent? You know, or do we want to switch to some kind of service model? You know, my parents came from the north of England. I've seen what happens when you deindustrialize a country. I would be very concerned about that phenomenon writ large at European level, not only for its consequences for our economy, but for our politics and our society. It worries me.
Yeah, I would say that it's clear that we're already witnessing, to a large extent, you know, massive industrialization across all manufacturing sectors, and indeed, I guess sometimes the argument is too quickly moved on to, you know, the Chinese competition. But again, the case of aluminium, you know, with production just outside, you know, our borders in the north and to the south, shows that perhaps we need to better investigate what are the structural issues that are holding us back and are causing this the industrialization. So we talk about the electricity market liberalization, staying perhaps with the energy mix for a moment, because you already hinted at the green transition. I believe that perhaps another issue that we're facing is the idea that we can just satisfy all our energy needs through renewables. Is that a realistic view?
I always feel, when I get asked this type of question, I always feel, I worked in energy prior to this job, and I think I'm as enthusiastic as one can be about renewables. But I mean, the simple answer is no, at least not today. And everybody understands this, everybody should. It's easy to get excited about solar production and wind power, and so we should. I mean, these things will have to be major features of the energy mix in the coming years and decades. But sometimes I see kind of a lot of sing-song good news, whether it's on Twitter or LinkedIn, about solar power fully meeting a certain region or country's needs during a certain week in the month of May. And that's okay, and that's all true. And there's been huge growth and huge progress on the technology and the cost. But I have a little game I like to play where I look at what happens kind of hour by hour with the German power mix in January and February, and it's quite striking, right? We are still highly dependent on conventional energy sources, and I don't think we do ourselves any favors by denying that reality or choosing not to see it. And that's not an argument for coal or for gas or for anything else, but it does seem to me just a matter of objective truth that for the moment and for the foreseeable future, no, we're not going to have a system which is entirely renewable based. I can't imagine.
Is renewable ever going to be the solution? Because then you need to talk about, storage, you need to talk about hydrogen, you need to talk about, again, massive investment. But there still seems to be a lot of resistance. It's quite interesting because when you raise the question about the energy mix, also to the institutions, normally the answer, the standard answer you get is that the energy mix is competence of the national governments.
Yeah.
But it's funny because
fantastic.
We do have the renewable energies directed that mandates targets for percentage of renewable in the national energy mix. So I think probably that answer is not correct either, right?
I mean, the EU cannot, on one hand, be kind of architect of the long-term energy transition and not responsible for the question of the energy mix. I mean, it's a gray area, but I mean, obviously these things are inseparable from one another. The other thing that occurs to me is I think people sometimes have problems with looking carefully enough at the scale, the size of these things. When the energy crisis, the energy price crisis was at its peak, kind of summer, autumn 2022, which is soon after I arrived in this job, and we were at 300 euros a megawatt hour for gas. I had a friend who works in renewables say to me, well, why don't you just put solar panels on the roof?
Doesn't work like that.
First of all, we do. I mean, I know this, like in our industry, CEOs are scrambling to do these things because they make sense. Why not put solar panels on the roof? But you can take an enormous industrial facility like an aluminium smelter. You can cover the whole thing in hundreds of meters hundreds of square meters with solar panels, and they will produce 3 to 5% of the power that's required over the course of the year for that facility. So it's fine, but it's not enough. And yeah, these things are base load. They are electro intensive, which means they need large volumes all the time, and they tend to run 24/7. You don't ramp these things up and down. And that's another thing that is maybe not, and it's perfectly normal. People don't necessarily know this, but that's how it is. And so
you can just shut it down and then restart it. I mean, you can for a very limited time, because otherwise it will solidifies, right?
Otherwise, you destroy the facility, which would be unfortunate. So we need to, reconcile our need for materials like aluminium with our desire to have a clean energy system. There are sometimes trade-offs, and in time, I really hope to see the energy system evolve in such a way that it can meet our needs with clean energy. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I'm often told,
But it's nuclear energy,
yeah, of course, nuclear
not
comes
part
up
of the
straight
clean
away.
energies then.
And it is, and depending on the country, I mean, in France, this works. It's with the biggest smelter in the European Union is in Dunkirk, and it works because there's a great big EDF power plant next door, and it provides carbon-free power to that facility. However, if I'm honest, and this is just a personal consideration, but when I hear people telling me that we just need to roll out a new generation of nuclear, when I look at what's going on with nuclear power projects, I tend to see that they're 10 years late and 10 billion over budget. So if it's there, great. If it can be built quickly and affordably, I'm interested.
But that's an interesting numbers, because I was also looking into these figures, and it's interesting because in South Korea, for example, the time of going from decision to development and then having the new nuclear reactor is very short. I think it's 6 years probably at the most, and the costs are also very low. And the main reason is that they never got rid of their expertise. And also, there is then the problem of the NIMBY issue either. Yeah. So again, having basically dismantled, and I come from Italy, the country that was the leader in nuclear energy until the 80s, until Chernobyl, until we had a referendum. And again, on the emotions, we took the drastic decision of getting rid of nuclear, which we continue to import, of course, from our neighboring countries with all the potential risk as well in case, very rare of an accident. So that's again, I think, where the politicians in particular failed perhaps to perform the role of guiding the citizens, and rather than riding on the emotions of the moment, because everybody, of course, was very scared, very concerned. There was the first big nuclear accident. And then we saw exactly the same after Fukushima, and the decision that was taken in Germany, in Belgium as well. And it's interesting when you say, I play these games and I do exactly the same sometimes. And it's very frustrating because, when you look at the CO2 emissions per day, even when there is wind in Germany compared to France, the numbers are staggering. They're shocking. And where there is no wind, they're an absolute tragedy, right? Yeah. And I believe Germany last year extracted something like 80 million tons of lignite, on top of importing coal, of importing gas, and that can be good for our fight against climate change.
And there's something horribly irrational. I don't want to pick on Germany, but there's something really wrong when you're shutting down nuclear, shutting down coal in order to import power from France and Poland. I mean, it's weird. I mean, what you said about a referendum and decisions taken on the basis of feelings, it's a bit like Brexit. On one hand, it's great for people to participate in civic life and to be involved, to have a kind of active, lively democracy. But I'm not sure I'm not sure the general public should be asked all kinds of questions. Brexit strikes me as an obvious example. I'm not sure that question should ever have been, in fact, I'm sure that question shouldn't have been put to the public, not in that way anyway. And, I think that government has some responsibility to provide, as you say, guidance. I mean, if you ask, an ordinary person who has better things to think about all day long, well, do you like nuclear power? And they've just gone through, they've just watched what happened in Fukushima. It's quite understandable. People are, I don't want that. But I don't think that we're honest enough sometimes about the real choices that we need to make, the trade-offs that might exist. And I think, here in Brussels, as a kind of policy community, there is sometimes a reluctance to acknowledge that there are trade-offs. We're constantly told that all these things can work together. We can go green without harming our competitiveness or our security of supply. A nice, lovely triangle where everything fits. And that's kind of true, I think, if you're willing to take a very long-term view of history. But what happens in real life is that there are tensions and there are trade-offs and there are choices, and then maybe we're a bit surprised and frustrated when the consequences of those trade-offs start to impinge on our daily lives. And I think generally there's too much of a desire to pump out good news all the time, and as a consequence, not enough reflection on some of the hard choices we face as a society.
It's interesting because you mentioned trade-offs a couple of times, and that kind of leads me to think a couple of things. So indeed, I also experienced that, right? I see that big frustrations that there are trade-offs inevitably. So unless we address them and really, have evidence to decide on, data to take those decisions and assess, what's the best trade-off or the worst trade-off. Probably will continue to have then as an outcome policies and legislation that then will result potentially in, failing to address the issue we wanted to address in the first place, or causing, let's say, inevitably additional impacts, right, that we didn't factor in properly. So, and that brings me to, the question of leadership. Is this due to the fact that we have seen progressively, less leadership? And I'm talking not just about, policymakers, decision maker in general, and in that, I think, business is also part of that. So on one hand, the politicians, the populism that we've seen rising everywhere in Europe, including, in this town as well, in Brussels, but also, from the business community, perhaps a kind of let's go along and let's not challenge. Do you think that's also a result of this?
So this let's go along, let's not challenge. We must have been doing this for around the same amount of time. I started 20 years ago. I remember when I first started to, go to events, and I was really there as a very junior person, maybe to take some notes and just listen. I was amazed at how little disagreement there was, or if there was, it was kind of really around the margin, so that everybody would agree about the basic principle, and then you would add, but maybe just this or that. And as I sort of grew up here, you start to learn that there's a frame in which it's possible to discuss. And if you step outside of that frame, and I'm not much of an extremist, so I'm not sure I was ever really inclined to, but basically, you're not rewarded for saying, sorry, this is, that's not true, or this is nonsense, or are we sure about this? What happens is not that you're, censored or anything like that, but you're maybe just kind of not invited back, or you feel you would risk influence if you were too frank. And so, you're incentivized to basically go along, and as you say, and we all are. That can't be healthy. That's not the basis for a lively, constructive public debate. That's groupthink.
We welcome position paper,
yes,
right?
And I've welcomed so many things in the last 20 years, and we all do it. And you're right, we welcome this because you don't want to be a bad citizen. You don't want to be an uncooperative actor. So you welcome the thing, and then you write. Now, actually, we hate almost all of it, but thank you so much for doing it. And just please read the small print to hear that everything that we would like to change or fix. I don't know. I don't know how much of that is just too many people in this city all having exactly the same background. I hear so much about the diversity in this city, and that's only because some people went to the LSE and some people did Sciences Po. That's not diversity. We're all.
So there is a bit of disconnect with the real world. That's what he's trying to say.
It's
the bubble story is true.
Yeah, sure.
There is a reason why it's called the bubble.
When I'm in England, especially when I'm back home with family, they think we're all crazy. They and I don't think that's a particularly British problem. It's
no, it's not. I experience the same when I go back to Italy.
No, it's really weird the way we all live and the things that we all talk about. And I don't know what's to be done about that. I don't see it really changing. At the moment. So we're into this new phase where people keep saying Draghi all the time and competitiveness all the time, and that's good. These are things we should be talking about. But no one's gotten braver or anything. It's just that the frame has been moved. So now we can all say these things and we sound terribly current.
Okay. So I wanted to ask you about emissions, but I want to stay on this actually,
sure,
because it's something that I'm kind of observing as well, right? And what I don't like too much, perhaps, is now we change the narrative. Mm-hmm. Now competitiveness is important. And when I joined the association I'm in now, European, 5 years ago, it seems like let's not. Competitiveness could not even be used in a position paper, right? No. And so the fact that now everybody recognizes that that's important, it feels like a little bit of a bad joke, right? And it kind of continues to fit in also a bit of that narrative, which I think has also been extremely detrimental to Europe, of there is a good industry and there is a bad industry. And going back perhaps to aluminium, again, when I go back in time, I do remember meetings, with officials where we're clearly told we don't need these industries anymore in Europe, right? We need new industries. And as you hinted earlier, right, we can't do the transitions without these industries. Like they're essential to drive the green transition. We want to drive the digital transition. We want to drive, and I think there is also a certain arrogance in assuming that we're leading something here, right? That Europe is leading by example. I heard that so many times, but then the kind of facts don't match the narrative, and but you say I'm not sure anything will change because. Now we talk more about this, but it's something really changing. So to that point, simplification and CBAM. Let me take you to the emissions there, to CBAM and carbon leakage. To what extent is this going to help, addressing competitiveness issue for the aluminium industry?
When I started, before, like I agreed to take this job maybe, 3 months before I started, something like that. So I had a little bit of time to think about it before I really got into it. And when you look at it, you could say, okay, this is an industry in trouble because of energy costs. Carbon leakage is going to be an issue. ETS is starting to bite. Free allocations won't last forever. And then you see this CBAM thing, and and it's a very appealing concept, right? It's a very seductive notion until you get into it, until you start talking to people who really work with this. And I say this all the time, I can say it in front of a camera. I've still never met anybody in the aluminium business who believes that CBAM is going to make things better. And the reasons for that are probably too numerous and complicated to mention, but basically it's going to come at the expense of the existing carbon leakage tools, which have actually worked relatively well, despite all the difficulties. But the carbon leakage protection that is in place now is meaningful.
You're talking about the indirect costs?
And indirect cost compensation and free allocations. They matter, it makes a big difference. They are the difference.
It took us a while with indirect costs, right? Because at the beginning it was only Germany that kind of provided the state aids.
But where it's there, it makes a difference. And it is the difference in many cases between a viable business model and its opposite. If that's to be replaced by CBAM, and if CBAM remains relatively easy to circumvent, because we have a lot of worries about that, and other worries, including the impact that it will have on prices further down the value chain. It's a little disheartening to be told, don't worry, CBAM's coming, and that's going to protect you.
That's interesting, because the aluminium industry has always been against at the beginning, and then you kind of force into it. And to the point you were making, right, I think, as we now have hardly any primary industry left in Europe, we need to import all these primaries. So, with CBAM, we risk further harming now the downstream industry too. So something like, again, very reasonable line of thinking, but then still you're into it now. And now we're hearing, I wonder whether, because what I'm hearing now, everybody's now going along anyway because it's there. A bit like the ETS is there to stay. And is there anyone challenging completely the fact that rather than simplify something that we know is going to cause further damage, should we now actually, but I don't hear any voices in town challenging CBAM as such. Why?
I think there are suggestions that it would be better to stop it, or this phrase "stop the clock," which has emerged over the last few months. There are discussions about that, whether it's the right thing to continue. I mean, we find ourselves having to do a few things at once. On one hand, like I cannot refuse to engage with the process, right? There's an ongoing process simplify is one thing, and we can talk about that in a minute, but it's also a question of refining and improving. There are aspects of CBAM which really require, I think, some more work. And to be fair to the Commission, particularly since the arrival of von der Leyen 2.0, they are genuinely, I think, curious about our concerns, more so than maybe 6 months ago, receptive to our arguments, ready to talk, ready to discuss, and I think genuinely ready to change. And it can be difficult to, on one hand, say, we're really not sure about this entire thing. And if it's here to protect the competitiveness of European industry, we'd better be quite certain that it's going to do that. It's difficult to be, on one hand, posing these kinds of existential questions, which we are, and at the same time working on the detail of the mechanism itself, because you somehow, when you work on the detail, you acknowledge the existence of the thing, but I think not working on it would be irresponsible. I mean, we'll see, like, whether there's any political space for a real discussion about pausing this until we get a clearer understanding of what the consequences are going to be, or whether we need to let it run for a little while, refine, improve it as much as possible, and say that, as soon as we begin to evaluate its real effects, if we see that what it's doing is undermining industry, then we stop it. It's a balance that has to be struck. But I do think harder questions are being asked about CBAM than was the case a year ago.
I want to pause the tape right here for a second, because what I'm hearing from Paul isn't just a story about aluminium. It's about the decisions we avoid making across sectors, across decades. We say we want to lead on climate. We say we want to defend industry, but too often Europe stops at good intentions, while the rest of the world moves with speed and scale. The question we are circling now is this: can Europe leadership actually lead? Or are we still more comfortable managing decline than building resilience? We'll pick that up next, because the answers we need aren't just technical. They're political and personal. And that takes me to the last point I wanted to discuss with you, which clearly is the international situation, the trade war. Again, I had the pleasure of experiencing that back in 2018 when I was still working for the industry. So the first aluminium tariff imposed by the US against Europe. CBAM itself, it's interesting from that perspective because, again, it's not a new thing, but it was started to be discussed probably 15 years ago. Mm-hmm. And at the time, it was very clear that everybody perceived this as something that wasn't being approved, under WTO rules. So the fact that now we do have it also says a lot, perhaps, about, the state of international trade and what, regions in the world feel they can do and impose on others. Yeah. But becomes really also an aspect that is going to weigh in the negotiations that are currently happening, between the EU and the US. Now the tariff has been further increased, from 10 to 25%. Those, if I'm not mistaken, are still there, right? Yeah. Because there has been retaliation from the EU, are not part of those that have been suspended. Correct. How do you see concretely that evolving, if you can at all, say something? But did you have hope that, and why aluminium, right? Why aluminium? Because there's never been these huge, perhaps, over-exports towards the US.
Yeah, I don't think it's about that. I mean, it can't be about volumes, and it certainly cannot be. I mean, objectively, I think it's very difficult to make the case that European aluminium is undermining national security in the United States of America. I mean, you can't do that. Nevertheless, he has done that. I mean, there are various consequences. I can talk about what's happening and what's happened. I don't think I'm going to do a very good job of talking about what's going to happen, because President Trump is a little bit volatile and unpredictable. I mean, the consequences for us, there are three big ones, really. So first, there's potentially, anyway, a loss of access to the US market, because some customers who were buying European aluminium products in the US will now decide not to, because the tariff makes them prohibitively expensive. First of all, the US is not a huge export market for the EU. It is a huge export market for certain companies, particularly with certain specialty products. So there are companies who are really heavily hit by this. Generally, though, it's not a huge issue, not least because a lot of the companies are saying, we'll send it anyway and we'll pay because we need the product. The second thing, of course, and that's a very live discussion right now, is what happens to metal from other parts of the world that would have gone to the US that doesn't now. And the EU remains a relatively open market. So is that product going to be sent here or dumped here? You may have seen in the Steel and Metals Action Plan, which, by the way, I thought was a good document. It came from the Commission a few weeks ago now. They talk about the possibility of safeguard measures. Now, safeguards that's a kind of bazooka. That's a big trade defense measure. And 6 months ago, I do not think that the discussion would have lasted very long if we'd gone to the Commission and asked for safeguards for aluminium. Right now, it is a political priority. I mean, they have said so very clearly, and we are talking to them every day at the moment about what such a measure might look like, what the scope would be, what the consequences would be. I feel, and this is something that really has changed, and this is why I don't want to say nothing's changed with this commission. I do think that their attitude to trade defense and trying to provide protection for strategic industries has changed. They do want to help. But then, of course, it becomes a spreadsheet exercise because that's how trade law is. So we're kind of we're knee deep in that at the moment. You asked why aluminium. I mean, I think steel and aluminium are. I think the American government views them quite correctly as being fundamental sort of building blocks for a lot of industries, including defense. And I think if you can't make your own metal, it leaves you in a very vulnerable position. And Donald Trump, how exactly he thinks through these things and what they look like in his mind, I'm not sure exactly. But I think if he's right about one thing, it's that protecting these big base industries is in the national interest. It's just maybe the way he's going about it, it's perhaps not how I would have done it.
Yeah, well, we're coming to the end of our time. There will still be a lot of things I would like to discuss, but perhaps as the main takeaway I take away from this conversation is that there is some glimpse of hope in terms of, the focus that we see coming from the institution on strategic industries. Perhaps on the energy part, electricity part, we're still a little bit lost in terms of what can be, the structural solution, and is anyone looking at the structural solution to take us out of, the situation that we're in. But let's keep thriving, and thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. See you again.
Thanks.